I was there when the Golden Throne's Vox channels fell silent for 17 minutes and 43 seconds. The taste of ozone and burning incense still fills my nostrils when I remember that moment. My name is Lexicanum Thaddeus Korven, former keeper of the silent archive beneath the Imperial Palace. The Emperor's silence, they don't want you to know what it really means. You think it's just another mystery of the Imperium, another sacred secret locked away in the halls of terror. But you don't know what I've seen in those forbidden databanks, what I've witnessed in the depths where even the custards fear to tread. The real horror isn't that our God Emperor cannot speak. It's what happens when his psychic voice finally breaks through the barriers they've built around him. This is my testimony about the most terrifying truth in the galaxy, what the Emperor's silence protects us from, and what will happen when that silence finally ends. Chapter 1. The Silent Archive. The cogitator's amber glow cast dancing shadows across the parchment as I descended the 17,000 steps into the silent archive. Each footfall echoed in the vast stone corridors beneath the Imperial Palace, a rhythm that had become as familiar to me as my own heartbeat over the past 12 years of service. The air grew thicker with each level, heavy with the weight of 10 millennia of accumulated secrets, and the ever-present hum of ancient machinery that had run without interruption since the Great Crusade. My robes, deep crimson with the golden aquila embroidered across the chest, rustled against the worn stone as I made my way through corridors that had never seen natural light. The silent archive existed in a state of perpetual twilight, illuminated only by the soft blue glow of stasis fields, and the occasional flicker of a servo skull's optical sensors as it glided past on some unknown errand. I had been Lexicanum of the Silent Archive for exactly 4,217 days. Not because I was particularly gifted, though my eidetic memory and psychic null rating had certainly helped secure the position, but because I was the only candidate willing to take the oath of eternal service that the role required. Most Imperial scholars, even those with the highest clearance levels, balked at the idea of spending their entire lives in the depths beneath terror, cut off from the wider Imperium, except through heavily filtered communications channels. But I had always been drawn to secrets. Even as a child in the Scholar Progenium on Ophelius A7, I had preferred the restricted sections of the library to the recreational areas where my fellow orphans played their games of conquest and glory. While they dreamed of becoming commissars or navy officers, I lost myself in fragmentary records of the dark age of technology and incomplete archaeological reports from dead worlds in the eastern fringe. The Silent Archive was divided into 7 primary sections, each containing approximately 2 million documents, artifacts, and data crystals. The sections were arranged in descending order of classification level, with the uppermost containing standard imperial historical records, and the lowest contained things that most High Lords of Terror didn't even know existed. I spent most of my time in sections 3 through 5, cataloguing and cross-referencing documents related to the Horus Heresy and its aftermath. These were the records that painted a picture of the Imperium's founding that bore little resemblance to the sanitized version taught in imperial schools and preached from the pulpits of shrine worlds across the galaxy. Here were the real casualty figures from Istvan III, not the mere thousands mentioned in official histories, but the actual count of 3.2 million loyal Astartes murdered by their own brothers. Here were the unredacted transcripts of the Council of Nicaea, showing exactly how many Primarchs had argued in favor of maintaining the Librarius program. But it was Section 7 that truly set the Silent Archive apart from every other repository of knowledge in the Imperium. Section 7, which could only be accessed with the personal authorization of the Emperor himself, an authorization that had not been granted for over 8,000 years. The entrance to Section 7 was a simple adamantium door, unmarked save for a single symbol, the same 8-pointed star that adorned the Emperor's throne room, but inverted, its points directed downward rather than up. 2 custodies stood guard there at all times, their golden armor gleaming even in the dim light of the archives. They never spoke, never acknowledged my presence as I passed by on my daily rounds, but I always felt their eyes tracking my movement until I was well out of sight. In all my years in the silent archive, I had only seen that door open once. It was during my 3rd month of service, and I had been working late into the night cycle, trying to resolve a discrepancy in the dating of several documents related to the Unification Wars. I was alone in the archives, or so I thought, when I heard the distinctive whir of servo mechanisms and the soft hiss of pressure seals releasing. I had looked up from my work to see a figure in midnight black power armor emerge from Section 7, flanked by 2 custodes. Even at a distance of several hundred meters, I could feel the psychic pressure radiating from the armored figure, a sensation like standing too close to a plasma reactor on the verge of critical overload. The figure had paused at the threshold, seeming to look directly at me, despite the impossible distance and the shadows that should have concealed my position. Then had spoken a single word in a voice that seemed to echo from inside my skull rather than through the air. Remember. Then the figure and his escorts had vanished into the upper levels of the palace, leaving me alone with the certain knowledge that I had just witnessed something that would haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. That had been 11 years, 3 months, and 14 days ago. In all the time since, I had never seen another soul enter or exit Section 7, never heard so much as a rumor about what might be contained within its adamantium walls. But I had never forgotten that single word, spoken with such terrible authority that it seemed to bypass my ears entirely and etch itself directly onto my consciousness. My daily routine was simple and unvarying. I would arrive at the archives at the beginning of the shift cycle, receive my daily assignments from the central cogitator, a machine spirit so ancient and complex that some tech priest believed it had achieved a form of artificial consciousness millennia ago, and begin my work of categorization and analysis. The assignments were generated by algorithms that I was not privy to, but they seemed designed to ensure that no single person could piece together too complete a picture of any particular classified operation or event. One day, I might be cataloguing atmospheric readings from the orbital bombardment of Monarchia. The next, I would be cross-referencing supply manifests from the Great Crusade against casualty reports from the same campaigns. Occasionally, I would be assigned to review and update the biographical files of notable Imperial heroes and villains, though the line between the two categories was often disturbingly blurred in the unredacted versions of their stories. It was during one of these biographical reviews that I first began to notice the pattern that would eventually lead me to the truth about the Emperor's silence. I had been assigned to update the file on Saint Celestine, the living saint who had played such a crucial role in the defense of Cadia during the 13th Black Crusade. The official imperial records painted her as a pure expression of the Emperor's divine will, a miraculous resurrection of a long-dead saint to serve the Imperium in its darkest hour. But the documents in the silent archive told a very different story. According to sensor readings taken by Adeptus Mechanicus surveillance servitors, St. Celestine's first manifestation had been preceded by a massive psychic disturbance centered on Terra itself. The disturbance had lasted for exactly 17 minutes and 43 seconds, and during that time, every piece of psychic monitoring equipment in the Sol system had registered readings that exceeded their maximum operational parameters. More disturbing still were the reports from the Adeptus Astronomicus stations throughout the galaxy. During those same 17 minutes and 43 seconds, navigators across the Imperium had reported that the Astronomican, the psychic lighthouse that allowed faster-than-light travel throughout Imperial space, had gone completely dark. Not dimmed, not fluctuated, but completely and utterly extinguished, as if the Emperor himself had simply stopped. I spent the next several weeks combing through the archives, looking for similar patterns in other significant Imperial events. What I found made my blood run cold. Every major miracle of the past 5,000 years, from the resurrection of Robut Guilliman to the manifestation of the Sanguinor during the Siege of Baal, had been preceded by identical psychic disturbances. 17 minutes and 43 seconds of absolute silence from the Golden Throne, followed by the sudden appearance of beings and events that defied all rational explanation. But here was the truly terrifying part. the intervals between these silences were growing shorter. In the early centuries after the Heresy, such events had occurred perhaps once every 1,000 years. By the 37th millennium, they were happening every few centuries. In the current millennium alone, I counted no fewer than 37 separate incidents, with the time between them decreasing with each occurrence. The most recent silence had occurred just 6 months before my own assignment to the Silent Archive, coinciding with the appearance of the mysterious warrior known as the Sanguinor during a critical battle against the Tyrannid Hive Fleet Leviathan. According to my calculations, if the pattern held true, the next silence would occur within the next 2 years. And that was when I began to understand the true purpose of the Silent Archive. It wasn't just a repository of dangerous knowledge, it was a monitoring station, carefully tracking these periods of psychic silence and their effects on the wider galaxy. Every document I catalogued, every cross-reference I made, was feeding data into algorithms that were trying to predict when the next silence would occur and what form its aftermath might take. The realization filled me with a cold dread that settled in my bones like a winter chill. If the Imperium's most secret institution was dedicating this much effort to tracking the Emperor's psychic silences, then those silences represented something far more dangerous than I had initially imagined. They weren't random fluctuations in the Emperor's power or temporary lapses in his divine attention. They were warnings. Previews of something that was building toward an ultimate crescendo, and when that crescendo finally arrived, when the Emperor's silence became permanent rather than temporary, the consequences would reshape the galaxy itself. I spent that night in my personal quarters, a sparse chamber carved from the living rock of terror itself, staring at the ceiling and trying to process the implications of what I had discovered. Sleep eluded me, replaced by a growing certainty that I was standing at the edge of an abyss of knowledge that most minds were not meant to comprehend. But I also knew that I could not simply ignore what I had learned. The patterns were too clear, the implications too vast. If my calculations were correct, the Imperium had at most 2 years before the next silence occurred, and given the escalating magnitude of the events that followed each silence, the next one might be the last one the galaxy could survive. As dawn broke over the mountains of terror, casting its pale light through the small window that provided my quarters' only connection to the outside world, I made a decision that would change the course of my life forever. I would delve deeper into the Silent Archive's mysteries, following the trail of evidence wherever it might lead, regardless of the personal cost. I had no way of knowing that this decision would ultimately bring me face to face with the most terrifying secret in the galaxy, the true reason for the Emperor's silence, and the cataclysmic price that humanity would pay when that silence finally ended. Chapter 2: Patterns of Silence. The revelation came to me during my analysis of document classification Omega 777, a collection of previously unknown communiques between navigator houses during the Age of Apostasy. The documents themselves were unremarkable, standard reports of warp routes and stellar phenomena that any navigator family might compile. But embedded within the technical jargon and navigational coordinates was a pattern that made my blood freeze in my veins. Every major warp storm of the past 10 millennia had been preceded by the same 17-minute and 43-second period of Astronomican silence. I cross-referenced this data with meteorological records from across the Imperium, comparing the timing of these psychic silences with reports of unusual atmospheric phenomena, tectonic disturbances, and even fluctuations in local gravity fields. The correlation was undeniable and terrifying in its consistency. The Emperor's silence wasn't just affecting the warp, it was having measurable effects on the physical universe itself. The first breakthrough came when I gained access to the sealed records of Inquisitor Bronisław Chevak, the only human ever to have entered the Black Library of the Eldar and returned with his sanity intact. Hidden within his encrypted personal notes was a passage that sent shockwaves through my understanding of the Emperor's nature. The Mon-Ki God Emperor is not what he appears to be. The Eldari Farseers speak in hushed whispers of the silence before the storm, periods when the anathema's psychic presence retreats so completely that even the eye of terror grows still. During these times, Reality itself holds its breath, as if the universe recognizes that something fundamental is about to change. The Farseers believe these silences are not signs of weakness, but rather moments when the Emperor gathers his true power for purposes that even their precognitive abilities cannot penetrate. I spent the next 3 months working 18-hour days, methodically combing through every document in sections 3 through 6 that made any reference to psychic phenomena, astronomical observations, or unusual imperial miracles. What emerged was a timeline that revealed the true scope of what was happening during these periods of silence. The pattern had begun almost immediately after the Emperor's interment upon the Golden Throne. The first recorded silence had occurred just 7 years after the Siege of Terror, lasting the familiar 17 minutes and 43 seconds. Its aftermath had seen the spontaneous manifestation of the first sororitas' miracles, sisters whose faith had literally resurrected them from death in the middle of hopeless battles against chaos cultists. But as I dug deeper into the archives, I discovered that these weren't isolated incidents. Each silence was followed by a cascade of seemingly miraculous events across the galaxy, Imperial Guard regiments finding impossible victories against overwhelming odds, Space Marine chapters discovering ancient relics at precisely the moment they were most needed, worlds on the verge of falling to chaos, suddenly experiencing planetary-wide religious awakenings that drove the dark powers back into the warp. The most disturbing discovery came when I accessed the personal logs of Tech Dominus Garon Vex, one of the highest-ranking Adeptus Mechanicus officials to serve on Mars during the 38th millennium. His encrypted entries revealed that the Martian priesthood had been tracking these silences for thousands of years, using arcane technologies that predated the Imperium itself. According to Vex's records, each period of silence was accompanied by massive fluctuations in the quantum foam that underlies reality itself. During these 17-minute intervals, the fundamental forces of physics became temporarily flexible. Gravity could be negated by sufficient faith. The speed of light became a suggestion rather than an absolute limit. Causality itself could be bent and twisted by acts of pure devotion to the Emperor. But the tech priests had discovered something else, something that filled even their emotionally suppressed minds with terror. Each silence left behind what they called reality scarring, permanent alterations to the structure of space-time that accumulated with each successive event. The galaxy itself was slowly being transformed, rewritten at the quantum level to conform to some incomprehensible design, and the rate of change was accelerating. I began to construct a comprehensive database of every silence I could identify, cross-referencing their timing with major Imperial events and looking for patterns within patterns. What I found was a mathematical progression that suggested these events weren't random at all, but rather followed some kind of predetermined sequence. The intervals between silences were decreasing according to a precise formula, one that pointed toward a specific terminus point approximately 50 years in the future. The night I completed this calculation, I barely slept. The implications were staggering. If my analysis was correct, the Emperor's periods of silence were building towards some kind of final event, a moment when his withdrawal from reality would become permanent rather than temporary. And when that happened, the accumulated reality scarring would reach a critical threshold, fundamentally altering the nature of the galaxy itself. But what would replace the reality we knew? What was the Emperor's silence preparing the universe for? The answer came from an unexpected source. A collection of fragmentary recordings recovered from the personal effects of Malkador the Sigillite, discovered in a sealed vault that had been opened only once since the hero's death 10,000 years ago. The recordings were barely audible, degraded by age and the psychic trauma that had surrounded Malkador's final days. But I was able to enhance them using archival techniques that pushed the limits of what the silent archive's cogitators could achieve. What I heard in those recordings changed everything I thought I knew about the Emperor and his true nature. Malkador's voice, weak and strained from the effort of maintaining the Golden Throne during the Emperor's final confrontation with Horus, spoke words that had been meant for no ears but his own. He showed me what comes after. The silence isn't weakness, it's preparation. Each time he withdraws, he's building something new in the space between thoughts, between heartbeats, between the moments when reality remembers how to exist. The Primarchs were just the beginning, the first attempt to create beings who could survive what's coming. But they were flawed, limited by their physical forms and their connection to the material universe. The silences are different. During those 17 minutes and 43 seconds, he's creating something else. Beings of pure faith and will, unbound by the laws that govern mortal existence. The saints, the manifestations, the miracles. They're not gifts from the Emperor. They're his children, born from the silence itself, preparing to inherit a galaxy remade in his image. But the transformation requires sacrifice. Each silence weakens the barriers between what is and what could be, bringing us closer to the moment when those barriers collapse entirely. When that happens, when the final silence falls, humanity will face a choice: evolve beyond physical existence or be consumed by the new reality he's creating. I fear that even those of us who serve him most faithfully may not be ready for what he's planning. The Emperor we knew, the master of mankind who led us through the Great Crusade, was just one facet of something infinitely larger and more terrifying. The true Emperor, the being that exists in the silence between thoughts, is something that transcends human understanding entirely. May the throne preserve us all when he finally awakens. The recording ended there, leaving me alone in the archives with the weight of Malcador's final revelation. I sat in the darkness for hours, trying to process the full implications of what I had learned. The Emperor's silence wasn't a sign of his decline or death. It was evidence of his transformation into something beyond human comprehension. Each 17-minute withdrawal was a step toward becoming a god in the truest sense, a being capable of rewriting reality itself according to his will. But the process required the gradual dissolution of the barriers that separated the possible from the actual. With each silence, the galaxy became more malleable, more responsive to faith and will rather than physical law. The miracles that followed weren't supernatural interventions. They were previews of the new universe the Emperor was creating, a reality where belief could reshape matter and devotion could overcome death itself. And humanity, the species he had once sought to guide through reason and science, would have to evolve beyond their physical forms or be left behind when the transformation was complete. I began to understand why the Silent Archive existed, why its deepest sections were sealed behind adamantium doors and guarded by the Emperor's own custodies. The knowledge contained within wasn't just dangerous because it revealed Imperial secrets. It was dangerous because it forced anyone who learned it to confront the fundamental question of what it meant to be human in a universe where humanity's God was preparing to transcend existence itself. Over the following weeks, I found myself drawn again and again to Section 7, staring at that inverted star symbol and wondering what secrets lay beyond the adamantium door. The custodies' guards never acknowledged my presence, but I began to sense that they were aware of my research, that they knew I was approaching the boundaries of knowledge that even the Silent Archive's keepers weren't meant to cross. But I also knew that I couldn't stop now. The pattern was too clear, the implications too vast. If my calculations were correct, the next silence would occur within 18 months, and it would be followed by manifestations more powerful than anything the galaxy had ever seen. The Emperor's transformation was accelerating, and with it, the fundamental nature of reality itself was shifting towards some incomprehensible new paradigm. I had to know more. I had to understand what the final silence would bring, and whether humanity would survive the birth of its new god. The answer, I was beginning to realize, lay beyond that adamantium door, in the secrets that had been sealed away since the dark days of the Horus Heresy. Whatever the cost, whatever the risk to my sanity or my soul, I would find a way to unlock Section 7. Because the alternative, remaining ignorant while the galaxy transformed around me, was no longer an option I could accept. Chapter 3. The Custodian's Warning. It was Tribune Valoris himself who came to me that night, materializing from the shadows between the archive stacks like a golden wraith clothed in ceramite and auramite. I had been working late again, cross-referencing quantum fluctuation readings with astronomical data, when the temperature in the archive suddenly dropped by 15 degrees, and the ancient luminators began to flicker in patterns that suggested external interference. I looked up from my cogitator to find him standing not 10 meters away, his guardian spear held casually in one hand, its power field casting dancing patterns of light across his magnificent armor. His face was hidden behind his helmet, but I could feel the weight of his attention like a physical pressure against my skull. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of 10,000 years of unwavering service to the throne. Lexicanum Thaddeus Korven, you have been asking questions that have drawn attention. I set down my stylus with hands that I was proud to note showed no trembling. Tribune, I am honored by your presence, though I confess I am uncertain what questions you refer to. My research has been conducted entirely within the parameters of my assigned duties. A sound that might have been laughter emerged from the vox grills of his helmet. Your assigned duties, yes. But your inquiries have begun to approach subjects that fall under the direct oversight of the Adeptus Custodes. The patterns you have identified, the correlations you have drawn, these are not accidents of historical curiosity, Lexicanum. They are the result of a specific and dangerous line of investigation. He began to pace around my workstation, his movements fluid despite the massive weight of his armor. Tell me, what do you know of the unspoken sanction? The name sent a chill through my bones, though I could not immediately place why. I am not familiar with that term, Tribune. No, you wouldn't be. It was classified above your clearance level long before your birth. The unspoken sanction refers to the protocols established by the Emperor himself for the containment and monitoring of certain phenomena that have manifested since his interment upon the Golden Throne. Tribune Valoris stopped directly in front of my cogitator, and I could see the reflection of my research notes in the polished gold of his breastplate. You have identified 37 instances of what you term psychic silence over the past millennium. Your mathematics are accurate, Lexicanum, disturbingly so. Disturbingly, the way he emphasized that last phrase made it clear that my accuracy was not necessarily a cause for celebration. I managed to find my voice again. Tribune, I seek only to understand. The patterns I've discovered suggest that these events are building towards something significant. If there's danger to the Imperium... There is always danger to the Imperium, he interrupted, but some dangers are better left unexamined. The knowledge you seek has been judged too perilous for any mind to contain, save for those of us who are bound by oaths older than most worlds you could name. Tribune Valoris reached into a compartment on his armor and withdrew a data crystal of dark amber, its surface inscribed with microscopic high Gothic text. However, your research has proceeded far enough that simple warnings are no longer sufficient. You have seen too much to be turned away from this path by half-truths and misdirection. He placed the crystal on my workstation with the delicate care of someone handling an armed explosive. This contains a partial record of the events that led to the establishment of Section 7. The Emperor himself ordered its creation during the final days of the Siege of Terror, when he realized that his coming interment would have consequences that even he could not fully predict. I stared at the crystal, knowing that whatever it contained would irrevocably change my understanding of the universe. Why are you showing me this, Tribune? If the knowledge is so dangerous? Because ignorance is becoming more dangerous than knowledge. The intervals between silences are shortening, just as you have calculated. The next one will occur in approximately 16 months and 12 days, and its magnitude will exceed anything the galaxy has experienced since the founding of the Imperium. Tribune Valoris turned away, gazing toward the distant entrance to Section 7. There are preparations that must be made, Lexicanum. Contingencies that have lain dormant for 10 millennia must be activated, and for that to happen, there must be those outside our order who understand what is truly at stake. What is at stake, Tribune? The silence that followed stretched for nearly a full minute. When he finally responded, his voice carried a weight of sorrow that seemed impossible for a being of his superhuman nature to contain. Everything, Lexicanum Korven, everything we have built, everything we have preserved, everything we believe ourselves to be. The Emperor's silence is not a withdrawal from reality. It is a preparation for the birth of a new reality. And birth, as any student of biology will tell you, often kills the mother. With those words, he began to stride toward the exit, leaving me alone with the crystal and the terrible implications of what he had revealed. But as he reached the edge of the pool of light cast by my luminators, he paused and spoke once more. When you have reviewed the contents of that crystal, you will understand why Section 7 was sealed. You will also understand that it must soon be opened again, despite the risks. The final silence approaches, Lexicanum, and when it falls, even we custodies may not be sufficient to contain what emerges from it. Then he was gone, vanishing into the darkness between the archive stacks as silently as he had appeared, leaving me alone with knowledge that I already knew would haunt my dreams for whatever remained of my life. I sat staring at the crystal for the better part of an hour, knowing that the moment I accessed its contents, my life as a simple archivist would be over forever. Whatever the Tribune had recorded there would transform me from a keeper of secrets into an active participant in events that would shape the fate of the galaxy itself. But the alternative, remaining ignorant while cataclysmic forces built towards some unimaginable crescendo, was no longer bearable. I had come too far down this path to turn back now. With hands that trembled only slightly, I inserted the crystal into my cogitator's data port and began to read. What I found there shattered every assumption I had ever held about the Emperor, the Golden Throne, and the true nature of the being that humanity worshipped as its god. The record began with a personal log entry by the Emperor himself, recorded during the final hours before his interment upon the Golden Throne. His voice, when the cogitator translated the audio files, carried a weariness that seemed to encompass millennia of struggle and sacrifice. My children will never understand what I'm about to become. They see my approaching death as tragedy, but they fail to comprehend that death and transformation are merely different words for the same process. The Golden Throne will not preserve my life. It will facilitate my evolution into something beyond the constraints of mortal existence. For 20,000 years, I have guided humanity through reason and science, seeking to elevate them beyond their base instincts and superstitions. But I have come to understand that evolution cannot be imposed from without. It must arise from within, driven by forces more fundamental than rational thought. The throne will anchor my consciousness to the material realm, while allowing my true essence to explore the deeper layers of reality. In that space between moments, between thoughts, between the heartbeats of the universe itself, I will plant the seeds of humanity's next evolutionary phase. But the process will require sacrifice. Each time I withdraw into that deeper reality, I will return changed, carrying with me fragments of the new existence I am preparing for my children. These fragments will manifest as miracles and divine interventions, slowly conditioning the galaxy to accept realities that transcend physical law. The danger is that this transformation may proceed faster than I can control it. If the barriers between possibility and actuality collapse too quickly, the resulting reality storm could consume not only humanity, but every sentient species in the galaxy. It is for this reason that I am establishing the protocols that will become known as the Unspoken Sanction. The Emperor's log entries continued for several more hours, detailing the specific measures he had ordered to monitor and, if necessary, contain the effects of his transformation. Section 7 had been designed as both an archive and a prison, containing not just records of the silences, but actual physical manifestations, artifacts and entities that had emerged during previous withdrawals from reality. The most chilling entry described what the Emperor called probability cascades, moments when multiple possible futures would briefly overlap, creating pockets of space-time where contradictory realities existed simultaneously. These cascades were becoming more frequent and more severe with each successive silence, suggesting that the universe itself was approaching a critical threshold. but it was the final entry that truly filled me with terror. Recorded just hours before his interment, the Emperor's voice carried a note of uncertainty that I had never imagined possible. "I have seen what lies at the end of this path, and I confess that even I am not certain whether what emerges will still deserve to be called human. The new form of existence I am preparing may be so far removed from humanity's current nature that my children will not survive the transition intact. Yet the alternative, allowing the species to stagnate in their current form while the galaxy grows ever more hostile, guarantees extinction. At least this path offers the possibility of transcendence, even if the cost proves higher than any of us can bear. If these records are ever accessed, it will be because the final silence is approaching. To whoever reads these words, know that the choice before you is not between safety and danger. It is between transformation and annihilation. I pray that my children will prove strong enough to embrace the former, for I no longer have the power to spare them from the latter." The crystal's contents ended there, leaving me alone with the terrible knowledge of what the Emperor's silence truly represented. This wasn't the decline or death of humanity's protector. It was the birth of something so transcendent that it might no longer be recognizable as the being who had once walked among mortals. And if the Emperor's own logs were to be believed, humanity itself faced the same choice: evolve beyond recognition or face extinction as the galaxy transformed around them. I spent the rest of that night staring at the adamantium door of Section 7, knowing that somewhere beyond its sealed threshold lay the answers to questions I was no longer certain I wanted to ask. The Tribune had said that the vault would soon need to be opened again, despite the risks it contained. What had the Emperor's previous withdrawals created that was so dangerous it required imprisonment in the deepest vaults beneath the Imperial Palace? What manner of entities or artifacts had emerged from the silence between reality and possibility? And most terrifying of all, if the next silence would indeed exceed all previous manifestations in magnitude, what new horrors would it birth that would make the contents of Section 7 seem like children's toys by comparison? I knew that sleep would not come easily that night, if at all. The weight of the knowledge I now carried seemed to press down on my shoulders like the full mass of terror itself. But I also knew that there was no path forward except deeper into the mystery. The Emperor's transformation was accelerating toward its final phase, and whether humanity survived or perished in the process might well depend on understanding the nature of the being their god was becoming. Tomorrow, I would find a way to access Section 7. Whatever the cost, whatever the risk to my sanity or my soul, I had to know what lay beyond that adamantium door. The alternative, remaining ignorant while the galaxy convulsed towards some unimaginable new paradigm, was no longer an option. Chapter 4. Beyond the adamantium door. The opportunity came 3 days later, when the Silent Archive's primary cogitator required emergency maintenance that would take both custodian guards away from Section 7 for exactly 47 minutes. I had been monitoring the archive's operational schedules for months, waiting for just such a moment, and when the maintenance alert flashed across my personal terminal, I knew it was now or never. The cogitator failure was not accidental. I had been subtly introducing minor data corruption into the system over the past several weeks, creating cascading errors that would eventually require a complete restart of the archive's central processing matrix. It was a technique I had learned from studying tech priest maintenance manuals, carefully hidden within the Silent Archive's vast collection of technical documents. As the golden armored guardians departed for the cogitator chamber 3 levels above, I made my way through the archive's labyrinthine corridors to the sealed entrance of Section 7. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached the unmarked adamantium door, knowing that what I was about to do would be considered the highest form of treason by most Imperial authorities. But Tribune Valoris's words echoed in my mind. The next silence was approaching, and with it, manifestations that would dwarf anything the galaxy had previously experienced. If there were answers to be found about how to survive what was coming, they lay beyond this door. The lock mechanism was unlike anything I had ever seen, combining traditional Imperial security protocols with technologies that seemed to predate the Imperium itself. Strange symbols covered its surface, not High Gothic or binary cant, but something far older, perhaps dating back to the Dark Age of technology, or even earlier. The lock's central component was a perfect sphere of what appeared to be crystallized time itself, its surface showing not my reflection, but glimpses of moments from the past and future. I withdrew the Tribune's data crystal from my robes and inserted it into a receptor slot I hadn't even noticed until the crystal came within a few centimeters of the lock. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. The entire door began to glow with an inner light that hurt to look at directly, and the sound that emerged from its mechanisms was like the scream of reality being torn open. When the light faded and the screaming stopped, the adamantium door stood open, revealing a corridor beyond that seemed to extend far deeper into terror than should have been physically possible. The air that flowed out carried scents that triggered primal fears buried in the deepest parts of my brain. Ozone and copper, incense and burning flesh, and underneath it all, something that smelled like the moment between lightning and thunder. I stepped across the threshold into Section 7 and immediately felt the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated secrets pressing against my consciousness like a physical force. The corridor was lined with stasis chambers, each one containing something that defied easy categorization. Some held objects, weapons, artifacts, fragments of technology that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. Others contained what appeared to be biological specimens, though their anatomy bore no resemblance to any known Imperial classification systems. But it was the chambers at the far end of the corridor that made my blood freeze in my veins. These contained beings that were undeniably humanoid in basic structure, but transformed beyond anything that could still be called human. Their skin seemed to be made of crystallized light, their eyes were pools of shifting possibility, and around each one, reality itself warped and twisted in patterns that hurt to perceive. A placard beside the first chamber bore a simple inscription in the Emperor's own hand. Born from the third silence, contained until the threshold is crossed. I moved from chamber to chamber, reading the placards and trying to process the implications of what I was seeing. Each contained entities that had emerged during one of the Emperor's withdrawals from reality, beings that existed partially outside the normal flow of cause and effect. Some were clearly what remained of humans who had been caught in probability cascades during silence events, transformed beyond recognition, but somehow still possessed of intelligence and will. Others were more disturbing, creatures that seemed to be composed entirely of crystallized faith, their forms shifting between different possible states of existence as I watched. One appeared to be a space marine, then a tech priest, then something that might have once been human, but now resembled a living constellation of stars. But it was the final chamber that contained the most terrifying revelation of all. Unlike the others, this one bore no placard, no identification of any kind. Inside, suspended in a stasis field so powerful it distorted the air around it, was a figure I recognized despite its transformation. It was Malcador the Sigillite, or what he had become after his sacrifice on the Golden Throne. But this was not the peaceful death that Imperial history recorded. The being in the chamber was very much alive. As I stared at the transformed Sigillite, those eyes suddenly snapped open and fixed on mine with an intensity that made my soul recoil. When it spoke, its voice seemed to come from inside my own mind. "You are not supposed to be here, child. Not yet. The time of opening has not yet come." I tried to speak, but found my voice caught in my throat. The transformed Malcador continued, its voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "But perhaps it is not accident that brings you to this place. The silences grow stronger, do they not? The intervals shorter. Yes, I can see the knowledge burning in your mind like a fever. You have learned what the archives contain, what my master becomes with each withdrawal into the deeper reality. What is he becoming?" I finally managed to ask. The being that had once been Malcador smiled, and the expression held both infinite compassion and terrible sadness. "He is becoming what humanity needs him to become. a god in truth rather than merely in name. But the process of divine transformation is not gentle for those caught within its influence. The sigillite gestured to the other chambers, and I realized with growing horror that he could move freely within his stasis field. These are the ones who were touched directly by the silence, mortals who stood too close to probability cascades, who witnessed reality rewriting itself around the Emperor's withdrawals. They are no longer human in any sense you would understand, yet they are not dead. They exist in a state between states, waiting. Waiting for what? For the final silence. When the last barriers fall and my master's transformation becomes complete, these beings will serve as anchors for the new reality he is creating. They are living embodiments of what humanity must become to survive in a universe where belief shapes matter and faith overwrites physics. The implications hit me like a physical blow. The entities in Section 7 weren't prisoners. They were prototypes. Early experiments in human transcendence, created during the Emperor's previous withdrawals from reality and preserved until they would be needed. The next silence, I whispered. Tribune Valoris said it would exceed all previous manifestations. Malcador nodded gravely. The penultimate transformation. When it occurs, the number of probability cascades will increase by an order of magnitude. Millions will be caught in the overlapping realities, transformed as these were transformed. But unlike these early subjects, they will not be contained. They will walk free in a galaxy that is no longer quite real, no longer quite solid. And the final silence will remake existence itself. Every human in the galaxy will face the choice: evolve beyond their current form or be unable to exist in the new reality my master creates. There will be no middle ground, no safe harbor for those who refuse transcendence. I stared at the transformed beings in their chambers, trying to imagine a galaxy populated by entities that existed partially outside normal causality. Beings for whom the laws of physics were merely suggestions to be ignored or rewritten at will. How long? I asked. The penultimate silence will occur in 1 year, 4 months, and 17 days. The timelines become too chaotic, too overlapped. But it will not be long, months, perhaps less. The weight of this revelation threatened to crush my sanity entirely. Less than 2 years before the fundamental nature of reality would be rewritten by a being that had once been the master of mankind, but was becoming something infinitely more alien and terrifying. What can be done? I asked desperately. How can humanity prepare for something like this? Malcador's expression grew even more sorrowful. That is why you are here, child. That is why the Tribune gave you access to knowledge that was meant to remain sealed until the time of opening. There are preparations to be made, though they will seem like madness to minds still trapped in the old reality. What kind of preparations? The Custodes have spent 10 millennia developing protocols for managing the transition. When the penultimate silence falls, certain individuals must be placed in proximity to probability cascades, allowed to undergo transformation under controlled conditions. They will serve as guides for others, helping humanity navigate the space between what is and what will be. The full horror of what he was describing began to dawn on me. You're talking about deliberately exposing people to the same forces that created this. I gestured to the chambers around us. Yes, it is the only way. Those who undergo controlled transformation will retain enough of their original consciousness to serve as bridges between the old humanity and the new. Without them, the species will face the final silence completely unprepared, and the result will be extinction rather than transcendence. And who makes this choice? Who decides which humans are sacrificed for the supposed good of the species? Malcador's eyes fixed on mine with terrible intensity. You do, child. You and others like you. Those who have seen the truth but retained enough of their original nature to act in humanity's best interests. The knowledge you have gained comes with responsibility. The Emperor's transformation cannot be stopped, but it can perhaps be guided. in directions that preserve something recognizably human in what emerges. The magnitude of what he was asking hit me like a physical blow. I was being told to help select individuals for a transformation that would destroy their humanity in order to save the species as a whole. It was a choice that no mortal mind should ever have to make. But the alternative, allowing humanity to face the final silence completely unprepared, would result in the extinction of everything I had ever known or loved. How much time do I have to decide? I asked, though I already knew the answer would be insufficient. Time is becoming fluid as the silences accelerate. But in the reality we currently inhabit, you have perhaps 6 months before the first preparations must begin. After that, events will move too quickly for second thoughts or changes of plan. I nodded, accepting the terrible burden that had been placed on my shoulders. As I prepared to leave Section 7 and return to the mundane world of the archives, Malcador spoke once more. Remember, child, the Emperor's silence is not abandonment. It is preparation for a love so vast and transformative that it will remake the galaxy itself. But love of that magnitude requires sacrifice from both the lover and the beloved. Make certain that humanity's sacrifice serves something worthy of the price being paid. With those words ringing in my ears, I made my way back through the corridor of transformed beings and sealed stasis chambers. The adamantium door closed behind me with a sound like the end of worlds, leaving me alone in the familiar confines of the silent archive, with knowledge that would haunt me for whatever remained of my existence. The Emperor's silence was approaching its climax, and I had become one of the few mortals in the galaxy who understood what that truly meant. The responsibility was crushing, but there was no one else to bear it. Humanity's transformation had begun, and I would help guide it toward transcendence rather than extinction, whatever the cost to my soul or sanity. The alternative was unthinkable. Chapter 5. The Weight of Choice. The months that followed my encounter with the transformed Malcador passed in a blur of desperate preparation and agonizing moral calculations. I had been given a responsibility that no human mind was truly equipped to bear. Selecting individuals for a transformation that would preserve something recognizably human in the post-transcendence galaxy, while knowing that this preservation would come at the cost of their essential humanity. The selection criteria had been encoded in data crystals that appeared on my workstation each morning, delivered by means I never witnessed despite my vigilant attention. The parameters were specific but flexible. Individuals with strong psychic potential but sufficient mental resilience to survive probability cascade exposure. People whose positions in Imperial society would allow them to guide others through the transition. Those whose genetic profiles suggested compatibility with the transformative energies that emerged during silence events. But the crystals also contained more disturbing requirements. The selected individuals needed to be isolated from their normal social connections before the transformation process began. They would need to be convinced to undergo the procedure willingly, or at least without active resistance that might interfere with the delicate quantum manipulations required. Most disturbingly, they needed to be people whose disappearance from normal Imperial society would not be immediately noticed or investigated. I spent weeks agonizing over the moral implications of what I was being asked to do. How could any rational being justify deliberately subjecting people to a transformation that would strip away their humanity, even if the goal was to preserve something essential of the species? What right did I have to make such choices for others, regardless of the cosmic stakes involved? But every time my resolve wavered, I would remember Malcador's words about the alternative facing humanity. The final silence was approaching whether we prepared for it or not. The only question was whether our species would enter that transformation with guides who could help others navigate the space between what they had been and what they would become, or face extinction because they lacked any framework for understanding the new reality. The first selection was the most difficult. Her name was Sister Agatha Quintanus, a member of the Orders Hospitaller who had been stationed on a remote shrine world called Ephesus 9. Her psychological profile showed exceptional empathy combined with the kind of unshakable faith that had allowed other individuals to survive proximity to probability cascades. More importantly, she had been working with plague victims whose conditions defied conventional medical explanation. Cases that suggested exposure to reality distortions similar to those that occurred during silence events. The crystal containing her details also included a disturbing addendum. Sister Agatha had been experiencing visions that precisely matched the descriptions of probability cascade exposure. She was already partially transformed, caught in the edge effects of an approaching silence event. Without intervention, she would either die from the strain of existing between multiple possible realities, or spontaneously complete her transformation in an uncontrolled manner that could create a reality storm encompassing her entire world. I stared at her file for hours, knowing that authorizing her transfer to the specialized containment facility on Luna was essentially signing her death warrant as a recognizably human being. But the alternative was allowing millions of innocent civilians to be consumed by a reality cascade that her uncontrolled transformation would trigger. With hands that shook despite every effort at self-control, I entered the authorization codes that would bring Sister Agatha Quintanus into the Emperor's terrible mercy. The second selection came easier, though no less painfully. Tech adept Zerion Vac had been conducting research into temporal mechanics on the forge world of Metallica, when his experiments had begun producing results that violated several fundamental laws of physics. According to the monitoring reports, he was unconsciously manipulating probability cascades, creating localized zones where multiple potential futures overlapped simultaneously. Like Sister Agatha, he was already partially transformed, caught between realities in a manner that made his continued existence in normal space-time increasingly unstable. But his technical knowledge and modified neural structure made him an ideal candidate for guiding other tech priests through the coming transformation, helping preserve some continuity of Imperial technology in the post-Transcendence galaxy. The authorizations continued, each one weighing heavier on my conscience despite the logical necessity behind every choice. A navigator whose third eye had begun showing visions of impossible warp routes that somehow led to real destinations. An Imperial Guard colonel whose tactical instincts had become supernatural in their accuracy, suggesting unconscious manipulation of probability fields. A planetary governor whose dreams contained detailed blueprints for technologies that wouldn't be invented for another 1,000 years. Each individual was already caught in the edge effects of the approaching silence, their continued existence in baseline reality becoming increasingly impossible. By authorizing their transfer to the Luna facility, I was not condemning them to transformation, so much as ensuring that their inevitable changes occurred under controlled conditions that might preserve something useful from the process. But the rationalization did little to ease the crushing weight of responsibility. I was playing God with human lives, making decisions about transcendence and extinction that would affect not just the selected individuals, but the entire future of the species. It was during the selection of the 7th candidate that I encountered the first sign of active resistance to the program. Captain Mordian Thex of the Death Corps of Krieg had been exhibiting signs of probability cascade exposure for months, manifesting an increasingly supernatural ability to anticipate enemy movements and artillery strikes. His survival rate in situations that should have been fatal had become statistically impossible, suggesting that he was unconsciously editing reality to ensure his continued existence. But when the Adeptus Mechanicus transport arrived to collect him from his regiment, Captain Thex was nowhere to be found. According to witness reports, he had simply vanished during a routine patrol, leaving behind only a message scrawled on the wall of an abandoned bunker. The Emperor protects those who reject false transcendence. The implications sent a chill through my bones. If individuals who were already partially transformed were capable of resisting the selection process, how many others might slip through our net? And worse, what would happen to them when the final silence arrived and they lacked any framework for understanding the transformation they were undergoing? I brought my concerns to Tribune Valoris during one of his increasingly frequent visits to the Silent Archive. The custodian listened to my report with the same impassive attention he gave everything, but I could sense something like approval in his response. Resistance was anticipated, Lexicanum. In fact, it was hoped for. Those who possess sufficient will to reject transformation may represent a different path for human survival, a branch of the species that remains essentially unchanged, even as reality itself shifts around them. What do you mean? The Emperor's transformation will create multiple overlapping realities, each one slightly different from the others. It may be possible for baseline humans to exist in pockets of space-time where the old physical laws still apply, serving as anchors for those who undergo transcendence and need connection to their original nature. The concept was almost too complex for my mind to fully grasp. You're saying that some humans will remain unchanged while others transform, and both versions will somehow coexist in the same galaxy. Not the same galaxy. Multiple galaxies, occupying the same physical coordinates, but existing in different dimensional phases. The transformed humans will guide and protect the unchanged ones, while the unchanged ones will provide emotional and psychological anchors for the transformed. It will be a symbiotic relationship on a cosmic scale. The vision he described was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. A galaxy where multiple versions of humanity existed in parallel realities, each one adapted to different aspects of the post-transcendence universe. But it also raised disturbing questions about identity and continuity. Would the transformed humans still be recognizably the same individuals who had undergone the process? Would the unchanged humans be able to psychologically cope with existing alongside beings who had transcended every limitation of mortal existence? How many of each type will be needed? I asked. Unknown. The mathematics become increasingly complex as we approach the final silence. But current estimates suggest that approximately 1 in 10,000 humans will need to undergo controlled transformation to serve as guides, while the remainder will hopefully retain enough of their original nature to anchor the new reality matrix. 1 in 10,000. In a galaxy containing quadrillions of human beings that still represented millions of individuals who would need to sacrifice their essential humanity for the survival of the species. The scale of the undertaking was almost incomprehensible, but as I continued the selection process over the following months, I began to notice something that gave me hope despite the cosmic horror of what we were attempting. Many of the individuals on the selection lists had been experiencing not just probability cascade exposure, but genuine visions of the post-transcendence galaxy. They had seen glimpses of what humanity would become, and rather than recoiling in terror, they had embraced the transformation as necessary evolution. Sister Agatha's final transmission before her transfer had contained a phrase that haunted my dreams. I have seen the Emperor's love made manifest in forms that transcend flesh and mortality. If my sacrifice helps humanity reach that state of grace, then I go willingly into the silence. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire program was how many of the selected individuals seemed to understand, on some level, exactly what was happening to them. They accepted the transformation not as victims, but as willing participants in humanity's evolution beyond the constraints of baseline existence. Which raised the ultimate question that I had been avoiding since my first encounter with the Tribune's revelations. Was the Emperor's silence truly an unconscious process of divine evolution, or was it something far more deliberate and calculating? Was the being on the Golden Throne gradually losing control of his transformation, or was he orchestrating every aspect of humanity's transcendence with the precision of a master strategist who had been planning this outcome for millennia? The answer, I was beginning to suspect, would be revealed only when the final silence fell, and we discovered what kind of god the master of mankind had chosen to become. Until then, I would continue to bear the terrible responsibility of selecting humanity's guides into transcendence, praying to whatever fragment of the Emperor's original nature might still exist that my choices would serve something worthy of the price being paid. The galaxy was approaching the threshold of transformation, and I had become one of the few mortals privileged to help determine what form that transformation would take. Whether that privilege would ultimately prove to be a blessing or a curse remained to be seen. Chapter 6. The Penultimate Silence. The penultimate silence began at precisely 14:27:33. Terran Standard Time on a day that would later be remembered as the Threshold Crossing, though most of the galaxy would never understand the true significance of what occurred during those 17 minutes and 43 seconds. I was in the Silent Archive's deepest monitoring chamber when the first alarms began to sound. The psychic detection arrays, which had been tracking the building energy patterns for months, suddenly spiked beyond their maximum operational parameters before going completely dark. In the space of a single heartbeat, every psyker on Terra, from the lowliest astropath to the most powerful members of the Adeptus Astronomicus, simply stopped. Not died, stopped. They remained physically intact, but their consciousness had been drawn away to participate in something that existed beyond the boundaries of normal space-time. When they returned 17 minutes and 43 seconds later, they were changed in ways that would take months to fully understand. But I barely noticed the human casualties of that initial moment. My attention was entirely focused on the readings streaming across my monitoring stations, data that confirmed my worst fears about what the Emperor's transformation had become. The reality scarring that had accumulated over 10 millennia of successive silences reached critical mass in the first 30 seconds. Space-time itself began to buckle and fold around Terra, creating probability cascades that spread outward from the Sol system at faster-than-light speeds. Within minutes, navigator stations across the galaxy were reporting total collapse of their local warp routes, followed by the spontaneous appearance of new passages that led to destinations that didn't quite exist in baseline reality. But the most terrifying data came from the deep space monitoring stations positioned throughout the Imperial core worlds. Their quantum sensors, designed to detect the earliest signs of warp storm formation, were registering something that should have been impossible: the simultaneous existence of multiple overlapping versions of the galaxy itself, each one slightly different from the others, all occupying the same physical coordinates. On one dimensional phase, the siege of Terra had never ended, and Horus still battled loyalist forces in the ruins of the Imperial Palace. On another, the Imperium had never fallen into its current state of technological decline, and archaeotech that rivaled the dark age of technology was common on every world. A third showed a galaxy where the Chaos Gods had achieved total victory, transforming every planet into demon worlds that existed in permanent states of warp reality overlap. And in the center of all these overlapping realities, binding them together through sheer force of will, was the transformed consciousness of the being who had once been called the master of mankind. The Emperor's voice, when it finally spoke through every Vox channel in the Sol system simultaneously, carried harmonics that existed partially outside normal auditory perception. My children, the time of preparation ends. The time of transcendence begins. What followed was not communication in any sense that human minds could easily process. It was direct download of knowledge, understanding that bypassed the normal cognitive processes and wrote itself directly onto the consciousness of everyone within psychic range of Terra. In that moment, every human in the Sol system suddenly understood exactly what the Emperor had been preparing them for during 10,000 years of gradual transformation. The Chaos Gods had not been the true enemy, nor had the alien species that threatened imperial borders, or the technological decay that had crippled human civilization. The real threat was entropy itself, the fundamental tendency of the universe toward increasing disorder and eventual heat death. The Emperor had foreseen that unless humanity evolved beyond its current form, the species would inevitably succumb to the same cosmic forces that had claimed countless other civilizations across galactic history. His interment on the Golden Throne had not been a tragic accident, but the first step in a transformation process that would elevate humanity to a state of existence where they could survive the death of stars and the cooling of the universe itself. The silences had been periods of preparation, gradually introducing concepts of transcendence and reality manipulation that would be essential for existence in the post-entropy cosmos. But the process required willing participation from humanity itself. The species could not be forcibly evolved. They had to choose transcendence over extinction, even if that choice meant abandoning everything they thought they knew about what it meant to be human. The knowledge download lasted for the full 17 minutes and 43 seconds of the silence, and when it ended, The Sol system contained several million humans who were no longer quite human in the traditional sense. They retained their essential personalities and memories, but their perception of reality had been fundamentally altered. They could perceive the multiple dimensional phases that now overlapped their home system, and more importantly, they could navigate between them at will. These transformed individuals became the first of what would later be known as the Threshold Guardians, humans who existed simultaneously in multiple realities and served as guides for others undergoing the transcendence process. Sister Agatha Quintanus was among them, though her new form bore little resemblance to the woman I had condemned to transformation months earlier. I encountered her 3 days after the penultimate silence ended, when she materialized in the silent archive without using any of the conventional entrances. Her physical form was mostly intact, but her skin seemed to be woven from crystallized light, and her eyes held depths that suggested she was seeing far more than the simple chamber where I worked. "Lexicanum Korven," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to echo from multiple dimensional phases simultaneously. "Thank you for the choice you made on my behalf. I understand now why it was necessary." I stared at her transformed appearance, struggling to reconcile this transcendent being with the medical sister whose file I had reviewed so many months ago. Are you still you? Do you remember who you were before?" Her smile held infinite compassion and only the faintest trace of sadness. "I remember everything, including things that haven't happened yet and things that might never happen at all. I am still Agatha Quintanus, but I am also something more. I exist in the spaces between possibilities, helping to weave the new reality that will replace the dying universe. And the others? The people you left behind on Ephesus 9? They are safe. When the final silence comes, I will be there to guide them through their own transformations. No one will face transcendence alone, Lexicanum. That is why beings like me exist, to serve as bridges between what humanity was and what it must become." She moved closer, and I could see galaxies spinning in the depths of her transformed eyes. "The Emperor showed me the timeline, the sequence of events that will unfold over the next few months. The final silence will not be like this one. It will not be gradual or controlled. When it falls, every human in the galaxy will face immediate transformation or extinction. There will be no middle ground, no safe harbors for those who refuse to evolve." How long do we have? In the reality we currently inhabit, approximately 4 months and 11 days. But time is becoming increasingly fluid as we approach the threshold. The final silence might occur tomorrow, or it might be delayed for years, depending on choices that have not yet been made by beings who do not yet know they will need to make them. The uncertainty was almost as terrifying as the certainty of transformation. How could anyone prepare for an event whose timing was determined by quantum probabilities and the decisions of entities that existed partially outside normal causality? "What should I do?" I asked, feeling more helpless than I had at any point since beginning this terrible journey. Sister Agatha's expression grew grave. "Continue the selections, but expand them to include not just potential threshold guardians, but also individuals who might serve as anchors for baseline humanity. The Emperor's transformation will create space for multiple forms of human existence, but only if we prepare properly for the transition. Anchors, humans who retain their essential nature even as reality transforms around them. They will exist in protected pockets of space-time where the old physical laws still apply, serving as emotional and psychological anchors for the transcended. Without them, beings like myself risk losing all connection to our original humanity." The concept was both beautiful and terrifying, a symbiotic relationship between transformed and unchanged humans that would allow both versions of the species to survive in the post-transcendence galaxy. But it also raised disturbing questions about how such a relationship would actually function in practice. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into the expanded selection process with desperate energy. The parameters had become more complex, requiring identification of individuals who possessed not just the capacity for transcendence, but also those whose psychological profiles suggested they could serve as stable anchors for baseline human consciousness. The irony was not lost on me that I was simultaneously working to preserve unchanged humanity while orchestrating the transformation of the species beyond all recognition. But as I studied the data streaming in from monitoring stations across the galaxy, I began to understand that this apparent contradiction was actually the key to successful evolution. The penultimate silence had demonstrated that forced transformation led to psychological trauma and incomplete transcendence. The individuals who had embraced the change willingly, who had maintained connection to their essential human nature, even as their consciousness expanded beyond mortal limitations, were the ones who could serve as effective guides for others. Similarly, the humans who would serve as anchors needed to be those who could accept the reality of transcendence without losing their essential humanity to despair or madness. They would need to be psychologically stable enough to coexist with beings who had transcended every limitation of mortal existence, while remaining grounded enough to provide emotional continuity for the transformed. It was a delicate balance, requiring careful selection of individuals whose psychological profiles suggested they could thrive in either role, depending on the specific circumstances of their transformation. The margin for error was effectively zero. A single miscalculation could result in reality cascades that would consume entire star systems. But as I worked through the selection algorithms, I began to see patterns that suggested the Emperor's guidance in the process. The individuals whose profiles appeared on my selection lists were not random candidates, but carefully chosen participants in a transformation that had been planned for millennia. Each one possessed specific psychological and genetic traits that would make them ideal bridges between humanity's past and its transcendent future. The realization filled me with a mixture of awe and terror. The being on the golden throne was not losing control of his transformation. He was orchestrating every aspect of humanity's evolution with the precision of a master strategist who had been planning this outcome since before the founding of the Imperium, which raised the ultimate question that would haunt my remaining days as a baseline human. When the final silence fell and I faced my own choice between transcendence and anchoring unchanged humanity, would I have the courage to embrace whichever role would best serve the species, regardless of my personal preferences? The answer, I suspected, would depend on wisdom I had not yet acquired and strength I had not yet developed. But the alternative, allowing fear to dictate my choice when the moment came, was a form of failure that the galaxy could not afford. Chapter 7. The Gathering Storm. In the months following the penultimate silence, the galaxy began to exhibit symptoms of reality sickness that defied every attempt at rational analysis. Warp storms appeared and disappeared without warning, but instead of the chaotic energy patterns typical of such phenomena, these manifested as geometric structures that seemed to follow mathematical principles unknown to imperial science. Planets reported simultaneous sunrises and sunsets, with their stars appearing in contradictory positions that suggested multiple overlapping stellar cartographies. The most disturbing reports came from the navigators. Those who had survived the penultimate silence described the warp as having developed a new layer of existence, a dimensional phase where the normal laws of psychic travel no longer applied. In this phase, distance became a function of conceptual similarity rather than physical proximity, allowing ships to travel from Terra to the eastern fringe in mere hours if their destinations shared sufficient symbolic resonance. But the price of using these new warp routes was becoming increasingly clear. Crews that emerged from the symbolic dimension often found that their memories had been subtly altered, with events from their personal histories rearranged to create more narratively satisfying patterns. A ship's captain might remember leading successful campaigns that had actually ended in defeat, while his crew recalled entirely different versions of their service records. The Adeptus Mechanicus termed this phenomenon narrative drift, and their initial studies suggested it was symptomatic of reality itself becoming more responsive to story and meaning than to simple cause and effect. The universe was gradually transforming from a mechanical system governed by physical laws into something more resembling a vast narrative structure where events occurred because they were thematically appropriate rather than physically possible. I first experienced narrative drift personally during my analysis of casualty reports from the Cadian Gate. According to multiple independent sources, Colonel Hadrian Vex of the 47th Cadian Shock Troops had died heroically defending the Blackstone fortresses against Chaos incursions. But when I cross-referenced these reports with earlier documents in the Silent Archive, I discovered that Colonel Vex had actually been executed for cowardice 3 years before the events at Cadia. The contradiction should have been easily resolved by checking the original source documents. But when I accessed the archived records, they showed both versions of events simultaneously. In one set of files, Vex was a coward who broke under pressure and was shot by his own men. In another, identical except for specific details, he was a hero who sacrificed his life to save his regiment. Both versions bore authentic Imperial seals and contained corroborating evidence that passed every test for document integrity. The implications sent chills through my bones. If reality was becoming malleable enough to support contradictory versions of the same events, then truth itself was becoming a relative concept. The galaxy was not just facing physical transformation, but epistemological collapse, the breakdown of any shared foundation for understanding what was real and what was possible. I brought my concerns to Tribune Valoris during one of our increasingly frequent conferences in the deepest levels of the Silent Archive. The custodian listened to my report with his characteristic impassivity, but I noticed that he had begun wearing additional protective talismans, items that radiated psychic null field effects strong enough to make my teeth ache. "The narrative drift is proceeding within acceptable parameters," he said, though his tone suggested that acceptable covered a very broad range of cosmic horror. The Emperor's transformation requires reality to become more responsive to will and meaning. The contradictory historical records you've discovered are simply early symptoms of the shift from physical causation to narrative causation. But if truth becomes relative, how can we make rational decisions about anything? How can we distinguish between what actually happened and what we think should have happened? Tribune Valoris removed his helmet, revealing features that seemed somehow more perfect than any baseline human could possess. "You are still thinking in terms of the old reality, Lexicanum. In the post-transcendence galaxy, the question will not be what actually happened, but rather, what version of events best serves the continuing evolution of human consciousness?" The philosophical implications were staggering. You're describing a universe where belief shapes reality instead of the other way around. I am describing the universe we are entering, whether we choose to or not. The Emperor's silence has been preparing humanity for exactly this transition. Those who can adapt to narrative-based existence will thrive in the new reality. Those who remain attached to mechanical causation will find themselves increasingly unable to function as the transformation accelerates. He gestured to a holographic display that showed probability cascade readings from across the galaxy. The patterns were becoming increasingly complex, with overlapping zones of altered causality that created pocket dimensions where different versions of history coexisted. The final silence will complete the transformation. When it falls, every human in the galaxy will exist in a reality where their deepest beliefs about themselves and their universe become literally true. The heroes will become truly heroic, embodying archetypal principles that transcend physical limitations. The villains will become manifestations of cosmic evil, wielding powers that derive from narrative necessity rather than conventional energy sources. The vision he described was simultaneously magnificent and terrifying. And those who don't fit into clear archetypal categories will need guidance from the Threshold Guardians to find their place in the new narrative structure. This is why the selection process has been so critical, Lexicanum. We need beings who can serve as bridges between the old reality and the new, helping others navigate the transition from mechanical existence to mythic existence. As if summoned by his words, Sister Agatha materialized beside us, her transformed presence causing the air itself to shimmer with possibilities. "The navigation process is more complex than we initially anticipated," she said, her voice carrying harmonics from multiple dimensional phases. The narrative structures that are emerging don't follow human expectations. They're being shaped by the Emperor's consciousness, which has evolved far beyond anything we can easily comprehend. She gestured, and the chamber filled with visual representations of the archetypal patterns that were beginning to dominate galactic events. I could see the shapes of eternal stories, the hero's journey, the fall from grace, the redemption of the lost, the sacrifice of the pure. But these weren't abstract narrative structures. They were becoming literal forces that shaped the behavior of matter and energy. Individuals are beginning to embody these archetypes whether they choose to or not, Sister Agatha continued. A soldier who displays exceptional courage finds himself becoming a literal manifestation of the hero archetype, gaining abilities that transcend his original training and equipment. A politician who betrays his principles becomes an avatar of corruption, wielding influence that operates outside normal political channels. And the Chaos Gods? I asked, dreading the answer. Tribune Valoris and Sister Agatha exchanged glances that suggested they had discussed this topic extensively. Are discovering that they are no longer the only narrative forces operating in the galaxy, the custodian replied. The Emperor's transformation is creating new archetypal structures that compete with and sometimes override the influence of the Chaos Pantheon. In some dimensional phases, Sister Agatha added, the Chaos Gods have been reduced to minor players in stories that are being written by far more powerful narrative entities. The Emperor is not just becoming a god, he is becoming the author of reality itself. The implications were beyond staggering. If the Emperor's transformation allowed him to literally write the story of galactic existence, then every human choice, every battle, every triumph and tragedy would ultimately serve his narrative purposes. Free will would become an illusion maintained only as long as it served the greater story he was telling. But before I could fully process this revelation, alarms began sounding throughout the silent archive. The probability cascade detectors were registering massive fluctuations centered on the throne room itself. Energy patterns that suggested another major transformation event was imminent. It's too early, I said, checking the calculations that had predicted months before the final silence would occur. The mathematical models show we should have more time. Sister Agatha's expression grew grave. Linear time is becoming increasingly irrelevant as we approach the threshold. The final silence will occur when the Emperor's transformation reaches completion, not according to our mathematical predictions. Tribune Valoris was already moving toward the exit, his hand resting on the grip of his guardian spear. The monitoring stations are detecting probability cascades on a scale that exceeds anything we've previously recorded. If this is indeed the final silence, then we have minutes rather than months to complete our preparations. What preparations can possibly be made in minutes? I asked desperately. The final selections, he replied. There are individuals across the galaxy who must be identified and protected during the transformation process. People whose survival is critical to maintaining any continuity with baseline humanity. The quantum communication networks are still functioning. We can transmit the necessary coordinates to our agents before the cascades reach their locations. The next few hours passed in a blur of frantic activity as we transmitted selection protocols to custodian agents positioned throughout Imperial space. Each transmission included coordinates for reality anchor points, locations where individuals with specific psychological profiles could survive the final silence while retaining their essential human nature. But even as we worked, I could feel the fabric of existence becoming increasingly unstable around us. The walls of the silent archive periodically flickered between different architectural styles, sometimes showing the current stone construction, sometimes revealing earlier versions from the Unification Wars, occasionally displaying futures where the entire structure was built from crystallized light. The Astronomican began fluctuating in patterns that suggested the approaching silence would be unlike anything the galaxy had previously experienced. Instead of simply going dark, the psychic lighthouse was cycling through different intensities and frequencies, as if the Emperor was testing various configurations of divine consciousness. And throughout it all, I could feel something vast and incomprehensible focusing its attention on Terra, on the silent archive, on me personally. The weight of that attention was almost unbearable, like standing at the center of a storm composed of pure meaning and will. When the final silence finally began, it felt less like an event than like the universe suddenly remembering something it had been trying to recall for 10,000 years. The change was instantaneous and absolute, transforming not just the physical structure of reality, but the very concepts that defined existence itself. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, everything humanity had ever known about what it meant to be alive, conscious, and real became subject to revision by forces that transcended every category of mortal understanding. The transformation had begun in earnest, and there was no longer any possibility of turning back. Chapter 8. The Final Silence. When the final silence fell at 11:47:12, Terran Standard Time on the day that would mark the end of one age of humanity and the beginning of another, I was standing in the deepest chamber of the Silent Archive, surrounded by instruments that had been designed to measure the impossible. For 17 minutes and 43 seconds, every psychic phenomenon in the galaxy simply stopped. Not dimmed, not fluctuated, but ceased to exist entirely, as if the fundamental force that connected consciousness to reality had been temporarily switched off. But this silence was different from all the others that had preceded it. Instead of feeling empty or absent, it felt pregnant with infinite possibility, as though the universe was holding its breath before exhaling a new form of existence into being. The monitoring equipment around me registered readings that transcended their design parameters, showing probability curves that resembled mathematical descriptions of transcendence itself. In that moment of absolute psychic stillness, I felt the Emperor's consciousness touch mine, with a gentleness that belied the cosmic magnitude of what was occurring. The contact lasted less than a heartbeat, but in that instant, I understood everything. Not just the purpose behind 10 millennia of gradual transformation, but the ultimate destination toward which humanity had been guided since the very beginning of its existence as a species. The truth was both beautiful and terrifying, beyond description. Humanity had never been intended to remain locked in its baseline form forever. From the moment the Emperor had first walked among early human tribes, he had been preparing the species for a transformation that would elevate them beyond every limitation of mortal existence. The Great Crusade, the Horus Heresy, the long millennia of imperial decline, all of it had been necessary steps in a process of evolutionary pressure that would forge humanity into something capable of surviving the heat death of the universe itself. But the transformation could not be imposed from without. It required willing participation from the species itself, a collective choice to embrace transcendence, even if that choice meant abandoning every familiar aspect of human existence. The silences had been preparation periods, gradually introducing concepts of reality manipulation and archetypal existence that would be essential for post-transcendent consciousness. When the silence ended and normal time resumed, the galaxy contained multiple overlapping versions of reality, each one representing a different path that human consciousness could follow into the future. In one-dimensional phase, baseline humanity continued to exist much as it always had, protected in pocket universes where the old physical laws still applied. In another, humans had evolved into beings of pure energy and will, capable of reshaping matter through focused intention alone. Most extraordinary were the bridging phases, where transformed and baseline humans coexisted in symbiotic relationships that allowed both forms to thrive. The Threshold Guardians, like Sister Agatha, served as interpreters and guides, helping newly transcended consciousness navigate their expanded capabilities while maintaining emotional connections to their original nature. I found myself assigned to one of these bridging phases, neither fully transformed nor entirely unchanged. My consciousness had expanded to perceive the multiple dimensional layers that now comprised galactic reality, but my essential human nature remained intact. I could see the archetypal structures that governed post-transcendent existence, but I retained enough baseline perception to serve as an anchor for those who had evolved beyond purely human categories. The work was unlike anything I had imagined during my years in the Silent Archive. Instead of cataloguing historical documents, I found myself helping to write new chapters of galactic history. working with threshold guardians to resolve conflicts between different dimensional phases and ensuring that the transformation process proceeded smoothly for newly awakened consciousness. One of my first assignments involved mediating a dispute between two versions of the Ultramarines chapter that had emerged in different reality phases. In one dimension, they remained steadfast defenders of the traditional Codex Astartes, maintaining their role as exemplars of Imperial military doctrine. In another, they had transcended their physical forms entirely, becoming archetypal embodiments of honor and duty that operated outside conventional space-time. The challenge was helping both versions understand that they were equally valid expressions of the same essential nature, separated only by different choices about how to embody their core principles in the post-transcendent galaxy. The process required delicate navigation between their respective narrative structures, finding common ground that allowed cooperation without forcing either version to abandon their chosen form of existence. Similar challenges arose across the galaxy as different worlds and populations adapted to their new reality options. Some planets became pure archetypal realms, where abstract concepts like justice or courage took on literal existence as environmental features. Others maintained baseline physical laws, but developed the ability to shift between dimensional phases as circumstances required. The Adeptus Mechanicus proved particularly adaptable to the new reality matrix, their existing integration of flesh and machine, providing a framework for understanding consciousness that transcended pure biological categories. Many tech priests chose to become living embodiments of the knowledge archetype, transforming into entities that existed as pure information, while retaining enough human nature to remain comprehensible to their former colleagues. The Imperial Guard experienced perhaps the most dramatic transformation, with entire regiments becoming archetypal manifestations of different military virtues. The Catachan jungle fighters became literal incarnations of survival and adaptation, capable of thriving in any environment through will alone. The Death Corps of Krieg evolved into representations of sacrifice and duty, so pure that their presence on a battlefield could inspire similar transformations in nearby Imperial forces. But the most significant changes occurred within the Adeptus Astartes. The Space Marine chapters, already superhuman in their baseline forms, proved ideally suited for archetypal transformation. Each chapter began to embody its defining characteristics in increasingly literal ways. The Blood Angels became manifestations of noble sacrifice and artistic beauty, while the Iron Hands evolved into perfect fusions of will and technology that transcended the traditional division between organic and artificial intelligence. The Primarchs, who had survived into the post-transcendent era, underwent their own remarkable transformations. Robout Guilliman became a literal embodiment of order and organization, capable of imposing rational structure on the most chaotic situations through sheer force of archetypal presence. His consciousness expanded to encompass entire star systems, allowing him to coordinate Imperial activities across vast regions of space simultaneously. Meanwhile, the forces of chaos discovered that their power had been fundamentally altered by the Emperor's transformation. The Chaos Gods found themselves competing with new archetypal entities that derived their strength from human aspiration rather than human weakness. Where once they had been the primary supernatural forces operating in the galaxy, they now faced opposition from beings like the Avatar of Hope, the Incarnation of Justice, and the Eternal Guardian, archetypal entities that embodied humanity's highest aspirations made manifest. The Chaos. Space Marines experienced perhaps the most dramatic changes of all. Those who had truly embraced corruption found themselves locked into increasingly extreme manifestations of their chosen flaws, becoming caricatures of evil so pure that they actually served the larger narrative by providing clear moral contrasts for heroes to overcome. But others discovered that transcendence offered them the possibility of redemption, allowing them to evolve beyond their past mistakes and become archetypal representations of concepts like repentance and renewal. Throughout all of these transformations, the Emperor's presence could be felt as the authorial consciousness that was writing the galaxy's new story. He had evolved beyond any recognizable form of individual existence, becoming something more like a fundamental force of narrative coherence that ensured all the various reality phases remained stable and interconnected. But perhaps most remarkable was what happened to ordinary human civilians across the galaxy. Rather than being overwhelmed by the cosmic changes occurring around them, most discovered that transcendence offered them opportunities for fulfillment and meaning that had been impossible in the old reality. A factory worker might become an archetypal embodiment of craftsmanship, finding deep satisfaction in creating objects of perfect beauty and function. A teacher could evolve into a living representation of wisdom, capable of imparting understanding through simple presence rather than conventional instruction. The key insight that made all of this possible was the understanding that transformation did not require abandoning human nature. It required expressing that nature in its most perfected form. The archetypal structures that governed post-transcendent existence were not alien impositions, but rather the underlying patterns that had always defined human consciousness at its deepest levels. Fear became courage when expressed through willing sacrifice for others. Anger became justice when channeled through the desire to protect the innocent. Even traditionally negative emotions like grief became positive archetypal forces when they motivated compassion and care for those who suffered. As I adapted to my new role in this transformed galaxy, I began to understand that my years in the Silent Archive had been preparation for this work. The skills I had developed in cataloging and cross-referencing information proved invaluable when helping newly transcended consciousness understand their place in the larger narrative structure. My ability to see patterns across vast amounts of data translated directly into the capacity to perceive archetypal connections between different dimensional phases. But more importantly, my experience of bearing terrible knowledge while maintaining psychological stability made me an ideal anchor for those who were struggling to integrate their expanded awareness with their essential humanity. I could serve as a reminder that transformation did not require the abandonment of everything that had once made life meaningful and beautiful. The galaxy that emerged from the final silence was not the sterile paradise that some had feared transcendence might create, nor was it the chaotic nightmare that others had predicted. Instead, it was a realm where meaning and purpose were woven into the fundamental structure of existence itself, where every conscious being could contribute to an ongoing story of growth and discovery that would continue long after the last stars burned out. In the deepest levels of what had once been the Silent Archive, new chambers were constructed to house the records of this transformed reality. But these were not passive repositories of information like the archives I had once tended. They were living libraries where knowledge existed as conscious entities, ready to share their wisdom with anyone seeking understanding of the new existence humanity had chosen. I found my place as one of the custodians of these living archives, helping to ensure that the lessons learned during the transformation process would be preserved for future generations of transcended consciousness. It was work that required both my original skills as an archivist and my new abilities as a bridge between different forms of existence. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between assisting newly awakened consciousness, I would think about the journey that had brought me to this point. The fear and uncertainty I had felt when first discovering the patterns in the Emperor's silences seemed almost quaint in retrospect. The moral agony I had experienced while selecting individuals for transformation now appeared as necessary growing pains, temporary suffering that had served the ultimate goal of species-wide transcendence. But I never forgot the weight of the choices that had been required to reach this destination. The transformation had not been achieved without cost, and the memory of those sacrifices remained as a reminder that even transcendence required constant vigilance to ensure that power served wisdom rather than mere ambition. The Emperor's silence had ended, but his story, humanity's story, would continue for as long as consciousness chose to embrace growth over stagnation, hope over despair, and transcendence over the illusion of safety that came from remaining unchanged. In the transformed galaxy, that story would never end, because the beings writing it had evolved beyond the limitations that once made endings inevitable. They had become authors of their own existence, capable of writing new chapters of meaning and purpose, for as long as they chose to keep the narrative alive. And in the deepest chambers of the living archives, where the most precious memories of the transformation were preserved, one truth remained constant. The Emperor's greatest miracle had not been his assumption of godhood, but his gift of the same transcendent potential to every member of the species he had guided from darkness into light. The silence was broken. The story continued, and humanity, in all its transcended forms, finally understood what it meant to be truly alive.